What if the war wasn't started because diplomacy failed, but precisely because it was working? That's the question nobody seems to want to answer, and honestly, the fact that nobody's asking it should tell you something. Let's rewind. Before the first missile landed, before the cameras started rolling and the headlines started screaming, there was a back channel, a quiet one, the kind that doesn't make it onto the evening news because, frankly, it complicates the story too much. Oman, not Iran, not the United States, was the bridge. The Omani foreign minister was shuttling messages between two governments who refused to sit in the same room, and by all accounts that have quietly surfaced since, it was moving, slowly, awkwardly, but moving. Here's where it gets interesting. The Trump administration had presented what they called their conditions for de-escalation. 3 demands. And if you read them carefully, really carefully, they don't look like the opening move of a negotiation. They look like the closing argument of someone who's already decided what comes next. First, Iran would have to end all uranium enrichment, including enrichment for civilian energy purposes. Not reduce, not cap end. Second, Tehran would have to sever its ties with every allied militia across the Middle East, the network that had taken decades to build and maintain. Third, Iran would need to dismantle and surrender its ballistic missile arsenal, the entire strategic deterrent, every layer of defense that keeps a country from being just another name on a target list. And in exchange, the United States offered not to attack, not a lifting of sanctions, not economic relief, not a seat at any table, just the implicit promise that the bombs wouldn't fall. For now, think about what that actually is. It's not a deal. It's a hostage note written in diplomatic language. Now here's the part that almost nobody covered. Through the Omani Channel, Iran signaled, for the first time, a willingness to engage with parts of those demands. Not all of them, but some of them. Enough to indicate that the regime, despite its public posturing, was calculating risk, not courting martyrdom. They were negotiating in good faith, or at least in survival mode, which in geopolitics amounts to the same thing. And then the strike happened. The Ayatollah was killed, the missiles landed, and the war that diplomacy was supposedly preventing became the war that replaced it. So the question isn't why Iran was at the table. That part's easy to understand. They were cornered. They saw what happened to Venezuela when it tried to wait out American pressure, and they made a rational calculation. The question is why the other side walked away from a negotiation that was producing results. History keeps giving us the same answer, and we keep refusing to read it. Cast your mind back to the Cuban Missile Crisis. The story most people learned in school is clean and heroic. Soviet aggression, American resolve, nuclear brinkmanship averted by Kennedy's steady hand. But that version leaves something out. The Soviets didn't place missiles in Cuba because they woke up one morning feeling ambitious. They placed them there because American missiles were already pointing at Moscow, from Italy and from Turkey. When the Soviets asked for those to be removed, they were told no. Cuba was the response. The provocation came first. It just wasn't the part of the story that made it into the textbooks. Or consider Pearl Harbor. The conventional image is of Japan launching an unprovoked sneak attack against a peaceful military installation. What tends to get skipped is that in the months prior, the United States had imposed a sweeping energy embargo on Japan, a country that imports roughly 90% of its oil. You don't embargo the energy supply of an island nation and then express shock when that nation makes a desperate military calculation. Japan wasn't choosing war. Japan was choosing between slow suffocation and a violent gamble. They chose the gamble. The pattern isn't subtle. What changes is the geography. Now zoom out and look at the board as it sits today. Iran has spent years cultivating a network of influence across the Middle East. Call it what you want, a defensive perimeter, a sphere of deterrence, a web of proxy relationships. To Iran, it's the thing that makes them harder to destroy. To Israel, it's the thing that makes them impossible to ignore. You've got Gaza and the remnants of Hamas to the southwest, Yemen to the south, still lobbing projectiles over the Red Sea, Lebanon to the north, where Hezbollah held its ground even after taking serious damage, and Syria threading through the middle of all of it. Israel's strategic calculus is not complicated. If you remove the source, you remove the network, break Iran, and the entire architecture collapses. What replaces it is a Middle East where one country holds overwhelming military dominance without a credible counterweight. And Washington, for its part, appears to be perfectly comfortable with that outcome. But here's where the chessboard reveals something most commentary ignores entirely. Russia and China, the two countries most capable of complicating an American military campaign in the region, both conspicuously quiet, both carefully uninvolved. Some observers chalk this up to restraint or principle. That interpretation requires a remarkable degree of wishful thinking. Trump is preparing to travel to China, the first sitting American president to make such a visit in decades. Meanwhile, American officials have been telegraphing their intentions through actions rather than words. Venezuela was the first demonstration. The United States applied pressure, imposed a stranglehold, and Maduro, for all his defiance, bent. The message wasn't sent through diplomatic cables, it was sent through observable events. Look what we did there. Look what we've done here. Now, what would you like to discuss? China's military doctrine is built on pragmatism before confrontation. They run cost-benefit analyses the way other governments run press conferences. And right now, China's energy situation is precarious in a way that doesn't get nearly enough attention. Roughly a third of their oil has historically come from Venezuelan sources. Another third flows through the Strait of Hormuz, the choke point that a prolonged conflict with Iran puts directly at risk. The final third comes from Russia, which has its own complications. Strip two of those three pillars, and you don't have an energy policy anymore. You have a leverage problem, which means that when Trump lands in Beijing, he won't be arriving empty-handed. The subtext of that conversation, if the signals are being read correctly, is a proposal. China stops buying Iranian oil, and in return starts buying American oil, or Iranian oil rerouted and resold through American-controlled intermediaries. Exactly the arrangement that's already been quietly constructed around Venezuelan reserves. It's an elegant mechanism, if you think about it, without the emotional language. You don't need to conquer a country to own its resources. You just need to control who's allowed to sell them. None of this is stated outright. None of it appears in official transcripts or press briefings. It lives in the gap between what leaders say publicly and what the sequencing of their actions reveals. The negotiations that happened before the bombs fell, the silence from capitals that should have been louder, the deal structures that mirror each other across different continents and different conflicts. You weren't supposed to connect those dots. That's not an accident. The media will keep counting casualties and debating the legality of the strikes. Politicians will keep invoking security threats and democratic values, and the machinery underneath it all will keep turning, guided by calculations that don't require your understanding, only your attention directed somewhere else. So the next time a conflict appears on your screen, fully formed and already explained, already assigned its villains and its justifications, ask yourself what was happening the week before. Ask who was in the room. Ask what was almost agreed to and why it wasn't. Because the part they don't tell you is almost always the part that matters most. I'll be debating the best takes. But what do you think? Will this quiet agreement with China pull through, or are we walking into an inevitable collapse in the Middle East? Let me know in the comments.